Hello, I'm Craig Constantine.
Hello, I'm Bruce Devereux.
Hi, Bruce. I always say I need more adjectives, but it is a distinct pleasure to finally capture you. I think you were like on my day one. I'm like, oh, I'm going to start a new podcast and I want to talk to Bruce. But it like took us a while. But to your credit, it's because one time I was like, hey, how about this week? You're like, well, I'm running, was it a triathlon or an ultra
It
man or
was,
something?
yeah, it was an ultra. It was training for a 3 day kind of mixed ultra mountain race event. So,
Yeah, so you're allowed to be hard to pin down. But we were talking before, as we do on all of these, and the word persistence came up. In fact, I think that when I emailed you and said, oh, thanks for grabbing a spot in my calendar, what do you want to talk about? It was like you wrote right back and said persistence. And I think I never know whether the show is for people who are making podcasts or people who are thinking about making podcasts. Um, so I think everybody who makes a podcast understands that persistence helps. Like if you are persistent, that pays off. But I'm just
mhm.
wondering, are there, do you think that podcasting has been like, I'm going to say like a positive feedback loop for your persistence, or does it sort of like become the thing, like persistence becomes the negative thing that feeds back into podcasting? Like that's what happens to me. I'm so persistent, it's a problem. And
Mm,
I'm just wondering how persistence has changed for you in your life in general now that you've really tried, like, because that's like the main tool, right? Like to
mhm,
be a successful podcaster, you need persistence and then you also need a microphone.
mhm, mhm. Well, you have the P for podcasting and the P for persistence. So I think they go kind of hand in hand, right?
Hmm.
And after I ignored all the fame and the money offers, um, you know, from my show and just people climbing all over it and everything, but no, not really. It's persistence is key, and I think for myself it hasn't been a negative at all. And I was thinking about that this morning when just before I came on, because it hasn't been a negative because every time I finish an episode, you go through those moments where you're like struggling going through the episode and trying to figure out what goes where. But the one thing I've noticed that every time I finish the episode, I step right back in to my little recording booth and think,
Hmm.
what's next? And it's a really interesting feeling, right? Because by the time I get one out the door and get it and post it online, I'm tired. It's because it takes a good bit of energy, plus with doing my other work that I do. But when I step back in the recording booth, I think, okay, what's the next one?
Hmm.
And so it sort of builds that cycle back up again. So that's been really, I think, a good indicator that it's been a really positive experience. So,
Do you get, I'm not fishing for personal life details, but do you get pushback from, people in your inner circles or like, shut up about the podcast? Or do you really manage to, go into your proverbial podcasting lab and just do the thing all by yourself? Or do you wind up trying to talk to people about it and then that goes bad?
well, I think probably I was in pod 6 with Akimbo, and that was at sort of the height of COVID. So that gave me an excuse to socially isolate from people. And it worked quite well because it helped to really sort of build my podcasting chops and get things up to steam. Um, and, since that, and we still are in COVID, obviously, and there's less socializing. So I tend to socialize more now through the podcast in my little booth that I'm in. So
Hmm.
no, I don't really get. I get encouragement. It's interesting, right? Because you wonder who's your biggest audience. Do a lot of your friends and family listen to your show? Um, and they do, but it's definitely not the majority. So they know it's
Right.
something that Bruce does. He goes into the closet and he interviews people.
Comes out all sweaty with his hair
Yeah.
smashed down, right? There's like
Uh,
podcasting hair is the thing you get if you wear your headphones all day.
well, I remember when I did an interview with Jewel, and I'm in the closet, and I think it was about 110 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and it was just so hot inside. And I'm chatting with Jewel, and I'm sure she's looking at me. I had ice bags on my feet, and the sweat is
Try
just
anything.
pouring down.
Right.
And I felt the recording went pretty well, but when I listened to it, I could hear myself a lot of the times gasping for air, like from in the like, and Jewel, I'd like to. But she did a great job of editing it, and it came out really well in the end. So,
It is interesting. One of the things that I really love doing is we were mentioning before, like, our projects, and you're like, you have a pretty big machine running here, and I'm like, yeah. And the other one, the big project, Movers Mindset, I do as many of the recordings in person as I can. That was obviously, I did. It isn't that I didn't record any outside at all during COVID, but that really made it challenging. We're like, all right, let's go record in a park, and I'll bring extra long cables so we can be 10 feet apart.
yeah,
Which was an interesting chance to have, like, when you put headphones on with the guests in person, I give them headphones and a microphone, and then I mix it so they hear a mix, which isn't what's being recorded, but they can hear me and them in their ears. So it's like pillow talk. So it was a lot of fun to have these really intimate conversations with people 10, 12 feet apart, in a time when they haven't been having a lot of social interaction. But I'm off on a tangent. For Movers Mindset, one of the things I like about recording out in the field with the guests is I get to go, like, often to their houses, or I have one scheduled for Sunday is going to be in a park or like in a university campus area. So I have no idea where we're going. Like, he's going to try and find us a spot. And then I have, a giant backpack and all this stuff that I can lug, and folding chairs. And, I just need 3 square meters, and we can do our
yeah.
thing. And that's super energizing for me to get, not necessarily into people's houses, but to get into a space that we're physically sharing. So I think that's a real thing that I draw energy from.
Well, and I can see that for sure. I mean, you are like when I mentioned earlier about persistence. You are persistent. Like, you are very persistent in the work that you do. Like, to me, that's absolutely amazing. Um, and it's interesting too. You're saying the in person. That's one of the things I'm really looking forward to this year, also, because I've only done 14 episodes, but I think only 2 of them had in-person interviews, which was, a great experience. I think it was the
Hmm.
first and the second, and then it really went to everything virtual. And the virtuals were really fun, and really a great connection with the individuals. But I really look forward to also being able to connect in person with people, definitely in the flesh, so
Yeah.
to speak.
How this, this is how Craig's brain works. How do you? I was going to say, walk the line, like balance between how much of you is in the thing that you're creating versus excuse me,
That's
just
all
had
right.
lunch, versus how much of the guest. So, like, if you do an interview or a conversation with someone, like, how do you personally decide how much of Bruce should be present and seen, and how much should Bruce be the documentarian who just holds the boom mic in? Don't ignore me, I'm just here holding the mic.
For myself, I try to take as much of myself as possible out of it. Um, it's an interview format, but I think what I'm making a shift. One thing that I've noticed, like when my direct interviews back and forth, like, I really enjoyed that with the guest, and but I realize it's not where I want to go with podcasting. Where I want to go with podcasting is more along the narrative,
Hmm.
storytelling, audio production, and just sort of work on that and have me sort of dip in and out of it a little bit. But my goal is always sort of weaving you know, extracting myself out of it as much as I
Yeah.
can. That's sort of the key, and try to make it more of that story line narrative with, rather than just a straight up interview for myself. That works best for me. So
I think I'm of a like mind. Um trying to think of a voice actor's name. I can't. There's like a TV series with a famous British narrator in it, and it's a lot of, like, Our Planet, and they shoot this amazing footage of everything, whatever they're, and then I want to say, like, Atkins or something is his last name, and
Oh God,
and
I
it's just
know.
got this, like, and here we see the emperor penguins, and like I can't even get close to doing it justice. You either know what I'm talking about,
Oh,
people
I
that are
know. I
listening, or you don't,
totally know what you're
right?
talking about.
So
Yeah,
so I
David
sometimes,
Attenborough.
yes, yes,
David Attenborough.
Attenborough, yes, thank you.
My coffee worked quicker than your coffee.
And sometimes I think, like, I look back at, like, I'll listen to something I did and I'll go, oh, there's too much of me there, or why did I, what, and I sometimes I think I have this urge to try and create in audio those magnificent circumspect creations that are those visual epics with that person narrating, and I'm just like, oh man, talk about setting the bar high to try and,
Hmm.
and even if, especially if I wasn't realizing that was what I was doing, if that's like quietly calling to me, that level of creation. So I'm wondering, are there people or podcasts or projects or shows or anything that you find yourself drawn to, either for inspiration or for, like, oh, you're going to do what? Oh, okay, the gloves are coming off. If you're doing that, then I'm going to try and do, like, they pull you higher. Any people come to mind in that area?
Oh, excuse me. Right off the bat, it's the How Sound
Mm,
podcast, HOW Sound
yes.
podcast with Rob Rosenthal. I love that podcast because it goes off in so many different areas and audio production. I mean, the NPR background, yeah, and just every show is so interesting, like just so interesting. Another one that I really like that I just sort of linked into was it's more of not so much a podcast, but it's Audio Playground. Have you heard of it?
I don't
Where
think I've
they
heard of that one.
Yeah, Audio Playground. So what they do is they give you a prompt. Um, you get emailed a prompt and then you record it and send it in. So I think the last prompt was you you're going back to the future kind of thing and meeting your former self and what do you say to them,
Hmm.
right? And they're always little short things, like they're anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes, and all different sort of audio skill tasks that you can work on for audio production, which is really really quite great. But how sound is definitely one of my favorite, and transom.org, right? So
Hmm.
it's just so rich with information and audio production, and yeah, it's amazing.
And the question I'm thinking is, like, if you had a blank check that actually wouldn't bounce, what would you build or create with your podcast? And what I was thinking was, what, I don't want to just say, what are you trying to accomplish? But,
Hmm.
as you do each episode, we each know that we're building a jigsaw puzzle, and maybe not even adjacent pieces. I'm just randomly making jigsaws and throwing them down. And is it, Dalmatians having a snowball battle, or is it, a Star Wars epic? Like, you have no idea when you're 3, 4 episodes in. But I'm
Hmm.
wondering if you're starting to figure out, like, oh, I would love to finish or to create some bigger thing, um,
Hmm.
with your podcast, or maybe it's the podcast is a part of some other mediums. Like, where would you go if resources weren't an issue?
Well, I don't think I'd go into video or film production along with it, that type of podcast. I really like the straight up audio, and the reason why I say that is I work in aging care, and in aging care, a lot of people have film, video, photos, say, of family and stuff, but very few have audio
Hmm.
of their loved ones or spouses. And I just find the audio production is just so rich. And I think in this day and age, when we're so bombarded with visual images and so many different TikTok, YouTube, so many different ways to see things all over the place, that I think people really still just enjoy the audio experience. And so that's for myself where I'd like to stay within that and build up production. I would see, if I had a blank check, I think it would be looking at slowly building a team, right? A team of creatives for writing, for assisting with production. But I don't envision some you know massive kind of podcast production audio studio, because I like the simplicity of it. The microphone, the small space. I'm kind of a minimalist in my life. I live in my wife and I and two cats live in a very small apartment that we rent. We don't have a lot of stuff. We tend to sit on the floor. We don't have a lot of furniture. I haven't owned a TV in 30 years. So that's sort of, I keep it on that. And I just, the experience, I think, of working with a team of creatives is key. I have lots of thoughts on that. And I think a lot of the times for creating the podcast, it's for myself, it's kind of managing that collision of thoughts that I have,
It's a
you
great
know,
word.
right?
Collision.
It's
I
just
was thinking,
like,
yeah, I
I
have a
just,
train wreck. Yes.
yeah, well, sometimes it's like a freeway pileup, right? And it's just like, thoughts are just smashing into one another and piling up. And I'm thinking, like, I can never get out of this mess. And then other times it feels like a smooth country road, where you're just kind of cruising along. The idea is nice and easy. And for me, to persist and persistence is trying to minimize those pileups, like trying to stop all that influence coming in and just trying to simplify everything that I do. And trying to figure out when somebody is listening to one of my podcasts, what are they experiencing? Right? Is it like, are they confused? Are they able to sit back and kind of relax? And am I able to create, and I think this is the goal for myself, am I able to create a sound environment for my listeners that somebody will spend 50 to 60 minutes in? And that's a lot in this day and age, as we know,
Right.
right? Like, to get somebody to listen to you for 50 to 60 minutes. Like, I'm always amazed when somebody leaves a comment or says, "Man, I listened to that podcast. That was great." And I'm thinking, wow, you,
Yes.
you listened, you sat down for 53 minutes. Well, no, actually I was doing the laundry, but, but, but
Still,
still,
that's because
they,
time is a gift, right? If somebody gives you their time.
yeah, yeah. And you're looking at, for myself also, it's like, say I'm about to start my next interview project and what I want to do with the person. So it's like, it's a bit of a maze. Like, I see it as, like bits and pieces and trying to figure out my way through it and what's the connecting thread. And it's always exciting for me when I can find the connecting thread. Like, how am I going to thread
Hmm.
this story together? Like my last episode, I had a lot of really interesting, the guest was fantastic and his life experiences were fantastic, but I really didn't know how to thread it together. Um, so I went from this maze, I found the thread, and, for a really bad cliche, to go from a maze to create something amazing,
Hmm.
um, is hopefully where I can get to with the project. So,
I loved your description of like the collision of thoughts. I totally have the same. We'll call that a problem. Some people would say, "Oh, it's a gift. You can have an infinite number of ideas." I'm like, no, it's also a problem. With great power comes great mental illness. And
mm-hmm.
what I'm wondering is, are there things that you can do or that you go to, like when you find yourself, in the, oh, here we go. Like I'm having one of these mornings where I'm in that space. Are there things that you do or things that you don't do, or like how do you wrangle that?
I step away. I just step away from it. I come out of this little cozy 10 square foot booth or move away from the computer. Fortunate where I live, I walk out my back door and we're basically in like a provincial park. Or I can go to the other side and we're basically on the beach. So, nature and the outdoors is how I sort of decompress. I get away from it. You have to, right? Especially audio work. You know, when I used to do film editing and such, I can just scream through film footage and pick things out on a blur, right? Like, oh, that's that image I want, right? And
Hmm.
piece all things together. So you have that visual reference. I find now that I'm really trying to work on training my audio brain, like trying to remember something that I listened to in the interview like 35 minutes ago and trying to think, okay, where is that section and can I pull that section out to move it in to here? I need it here. Right. And, being able to see the sound waves obviously helps. And now figuring out, I just in Hindenburg about cue markers and such, that makes a big difference. So that's really helped, um, and just sort of that mental kind of puzzle because it takes a lot of work, as you know, right? Like
Right.
you're building this thing kind of in space, and I think you come from a software background, right? Where
Right.
it's like
Yes. Yes.
you're building that in your brain before, as you're kind of coding it and stuff too. So for me, it's the same idea, and I always find it's interesting. I always find that my podcasts end up being in the 50 to 60-minute range, the majority of
Hmm.
them, and I think that's where they're going to land for me. So it's a fair chunk to be bouncing around in your head. So you do need to take that break from it, right?
Yeah. Well, speaking of time, as much as I hate to say it, I think that's a great place to stop for today. Doesn't have to be our only recorded conversation, but I think I totally agree with you about be outside, grounding in nature. There is something particularly exhausting about wrangling audio in your head. So,
Mm-hmm.
but all right, Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time and making a space to have a chat with me today.
Craig, it's been great. Fantastic. Thanks, man.